The Russian economy is looking pretty cooked. Even the central bank is pulling out all the stops to try to save the Russian ruble. Just what does this mean for Russia's war effort? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is one of those stories that doesn't get a lot of play, but man, it should. If you are here to see Ukraine win and sustain their fight, this is probably the best sign of their strategy working. Russia has hiked its interest rates to 21%. Now, again, if you're thinking that, guys, Russia's interest rate, like why is the little number next to my car loan the thing that's going to cause Russia a strategic defeat on the battlefield? Well, the answer is the fact that 21%, guys, in the United States, only like credit cards are currently offering that extremely high level of interest payments. And here's the problem, right? Russia is raising borrowing costs to the highest level in more than 20 years. And what that is a sign of is that inflation in Russia is out of control. And for context, right, in the United States, when we had our I'm going to use the word inflation crisis in quotes here, because obviously it really, if you're an American, like that shit sucked, and it still sort of sucks. But the difference is we got a handle on it by doing an unprecedented series of rate hikes in which we took our rate from basically zero up to a blistering 5%, guys. Okay? I say that inflation was at 9%. We had to control it, we had to bring our interest rate up to 5%. And the reason is when you have these high interest rates, right, the rationale is that high interest rates are borrowing costs, how much you have to pay to borrow money. And when you have these high inflation rates, it means there's too much money and there's not enough stuff, right? So everybody has all this cash, but there's only a couple of cars, there's only a couple of iPhones. And so people pay an arm and a leg for them, right? I'm saying cars and iPhones, but replace it with food, shelter. And so Russia's central bank is desperate to pull money out of the system, right? And so by raising the borrowing costs, it means that people are going to be reluctant to borrow money to purchase a house. They're not going to want to borrow money in the form of swiping things on their credit card, right? And so by raising these borrowing costs, the government is making sure that money isn't flowing into the system quite as fast. But you may notice something in my little story. In the United States, we were able to bring inflation down to about 3% by raising our central bank's rate to only about half of that problematic inflation, right? By the time we were at 5%, of our interest rates were at 5%, that 9% inflation was getting cooked. It was getting beat and coming down. Moscow doesn't seem to be able to beat it. Why? Because their interest rates are 21%. Now, officially, Moscow says that their inflation rate is just 9%. So you've got to ask yourself, why are they putting their foot on the brake and the economy isn't slowing down? And this is kind of the core problem, is that the Russians are starting to realize that their problem isn't about interest rates. The central bank and changing borrowing costs is not sufficient to address this, right? The U.S.'s inflation rate crisis was literally because there was too much money into an otherwise healthy economy. People had saved some money during COVID. They were spending a lot of it. There's a different problem here, right? A more fundamental one. And that is because Russia doesn't have the ability to get goods. It's not about the fact that there's too many rubles in the economy, is that there's too little of everything else. That is sanctioned goods, right? That is the fact that they can't import new cars from Europe. They can't import specialty electronics. They can't bring in anything. And the stuff they were supposed to make domestically, food, industrial goods, fertilizer, the people who were supposed to make those, they're all dead. Putin sent them off to die, right? Healthy working age males got liquidated to the tune of 500,000 of them. And this is in a country already suffering from a demographic crisis. And so what Russia's discovering is that the best a central bank can do is try to kind of force things back into balance. But ultimately, this is like taking Tylenol to cure your cancer. It's not going to. You might feel a little bit for a bit better for maybe a couple of hours, but it's not going to actually make you better in any measurable way. The only way to do it is to address the core symptom, which is the fact that the government is borrowing and spending a boatload of money in order to fund a war machine that's liquidating a lot of people. And until that core problem is addressed, the central bank is going to continue to raise rates. They're going to continue to cook the Russian people. Now, there's more problems than just that, right? And we're going to talk about Russia's sort of desperate attempt to try to get its imports going again. But before I do that, if you're curious about the fighting on the front lines, I have combat vet news, right? YouTube won't let me show GoPro combat footage. Like, for example, we just took a look at some of the video documentary from the International Legion about their Operation Shovel. It's some pretty sick footage, but I can't show it to you here. It's for members only over on combatvetnews.com. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we drop the members only videos, uncensored combat footage, the kind YouTube won't let me show you. We also have a weekly Q&A where you can submit questions and I answer them. So if you have the money and you want to support the channel, keep me independent, keep me able to do this, then you want to check us out on combatvetnews.com and become a member. The link's in the description. Okay. So Putin said, listen, I know a way around those pesky Western sanctions that'll save our economy. He goes, Bitcoin. That's right. Just like your weird cousin who's always smells funny, Putin too thinks that Bitcoin is going to save his shirt. But unfortunately, there's a problem. Russian banks are realizing that the Russian cryptocurrency, the so-called digital ruble, is going to cost them a ton of money. Right? It's going to cost them, in order to have this crypto ruble, they're going to need between $1.25 and $2 million of changes to their IT system to integrate with the central bank's digital ruble platform, right? And this is literally more than most Russian banks' entire IT budget. Now, the central bank doesn't give them a choice. It says you either get on board or get fucked. And a lot of banks, unfortunately, may just be getting fucked, right? Russian banks, listen, in Russia, as I point out, Russian oligarchs have been killed for less. So the fact that Russian bank leadership are complaining pretty loudly and pretty publicly about the high cost of entry of working with this central bank digital currency and connecting to their digital ruble is just prohibitive for smaller banks and overly expensive for main Russian banks. But the hope is that Russian countries, or rather Russian banks doing business with other countries, are going to be able to use this crypto ruble in order to circumvent or to bypass U.S. sanctions, that they can conduct business internationally without being detected by U.S. sanctions regimes. The problem is, of course, well, the problem's multifaceted, but the fact is that this is very, very expensive. This is going to be unclear if any of the countries Russia wishes to import from are even going to be willing to accept, electro money, right? I mean, listen, if you're not willing to accept the regular ruble because it's backed by the Russian government and heavily sanctioned, why on earth do you think they're going to accept a digital ruble? But this is a sign, again, the fact that this is so half-baked, the fact that this is so risky, the fact that it's so expensive to implement and Russia's still moving forward with it should tell you that Russia is looking pretty desperate. And we're not alone in saying that. In fact, some analysis by a major U.S. think tank points out that the Russian military, no matter how much Putin spends, may run out of resources by 2026, right? Now, one of the things that I think is sort of interesting is that the projection based on intelligence data that came from the Yalta European Strategy meeting synthesizes a lot of analysis by Western and Ukrainian officials. But it essentially argues that Russia's store of tanks will likely reach a critical inflection point at some time around 2026, right? And you can see, while there's a lot of tanks in storage, there's far fewer active tanks. And the thing is, with these tanks in storage, we use the word storage, but as they point out, about 60 to 70% are considered beyond repair. So they are not tanks. They are more like a collection of spare parts shaped roughly like a tank. And those are used to keep these active tanks running. You also have these issues in which the tanks that do need parts that could be made operational might not have access to the parts. So again, you're seeing that in 2026, right, the Russian military won't be able to sustain what its current tank levels, right? It rolled into Ukraine with 3,300 tanks, and since then, it's been essentially fighting with about 1,500 tanks. It now has about 1,900 on the battlefield. But once you start to have irreplaceable losses, Russia's actually experiencing a certain level of attrition, right? You can also see that not all tanks are created equal, and that while this depicts these tank casualties as diminishing slowly over time, at the end of the day, right, you can see that Russia is continuing to field T-72s, T-72Bs. These are relatively modern, but it also is willing to field T-64s. Yeah, that 64, that's the year it was designed, right? And T-62s, and even T-55s. That's right. These tanks predate like the moon landing. Okay, that's how old some of these tanks are currently on the battlefield. And at the end of the day, they are going to have higher attrition rates as more and more of the new shit gets blowed up, so to speak. The old shit is going to be fielded and is going to be put into higher risk situations, which in turn will lead to a greater, more rapid attrition rate. And so all of these factors combine with the fact that not just Russian military production thinks, is probably going to be unable to keep up, but you also have the fact that Russia's personnel, Russia's people may not be able to keep up. Again, at the current rate, by 2026, Russia would have to pay just an absolutely astronomical amount just to recruit one new soldier. It's currently paying $20,000 in bonuses for soldiers that sign up to fight. And that is going to only grow. And as a result, it's going to mean that Moscow's going to have to dig itself deeper into debt, which you might recall from earlier in the video, means spending more money, pushing the inflation rate. But ultimately, there's only one person, only one group of people who can really end this conflict, and that is the Russian public. At the end of the day, right now, the Russian public isn't feeling the pain of the war economically, right? The key difference is that for the Ukrainians, public surveys are clear. Overwhelmingly, they want to see the war continue. They want to kick Russia off their territory. But for Russia, this is more like their Vietnam War. It's a war of choice that their government led them into. And so if that results in a total economic disaster back home, the Russian public is not going to tolerate it. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Hit that subscribe button. Huge thank you to the folks like Bill Collier, Robert and Colburn, Guys, Marnie, Gina Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, L90, and Petra Taruru, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.